War is rough in our times, so the retreating army destroys food and the advancing rapes and pillages. These words were written in the 17th century. Back then, burning a harvest and dooming people to death by starvation was merely a matter of tactics. Women in the conquered territories were trophies just like silverware or, say, chandeliers. Has anything changed since then? Yes, it has. People came up with the propaganda. But have they stopped burning grain and raping women? Of course not. During World War II, Soviet propaganda called the mass rape of women in the occupied territories of Germany by the soldiers of the Red Army simply the revenge of the people. They said that the Nazis raped their women, so it was simply a human factor of revenge. In the territories occupied by Soviet troops, cases of mass rape were observed even among children of 8 to 12 years old. There is a number of memories of contemporaries of those events, which describe the inhuman cruelty of the representatives of the Army of Liberators when they carried out their civilizing mission in the territory of the defeated Third Reich, and how cruel their vengeance was. Contemporary German and Polish research proves the fact of mass rape committed by the soldiers of the Red Army. And it was worse. They not only committed rape, but also sadism and all forms of similar deviant behavior. In 2010, the Moscow publishing house Contra published a book of memoirs of a World War II veteran named Leonid Rabichev, which was eloquently named "The War Will Excuse Everything." A communications officer that didn't lose his human face even in war devoted many pages of his diary to disgusting, often openly animalistic behavior of Soviet troops in the occupied Germany. For example, let's take the following fragment. Women, mothers, and their daughters were lying to the left and right along the highway, and each of them had a cackling armada of men with their pants down standing in front of them. Those women that were bleeding and fainting were dragged to the side. Children that rushed to help them were shot dead. And their commanders, majors, and colonels were standing on the highway. Some were snickering, others were conducting, or rather regulating. The topic of the Soviet soldiers committing crimes against humanity was tabooed in the USSR, and it remains the same in present-day Russia, which makes testimonies of people like Leonid Rabichev all the more valuable, so that the truth would not go unnoticed, even though more and more of such evidence has been surfacing over the past several years. More specifically, a military diary of another Soviet officer, Vladimir Gelfand, was published in 2016, which depicts the Red Army troops as not just rapists, but also robbers, marauders, and generally speaking, not very civilized people. When a soldier appears from a Soviet working shack who had been a miner in Donbass or Kuzbas, or a metallurgist, and when they end up in a cozy German burger town, he would rob it, he would steal everything and bring it all home. But it was all hushed up ideologically. What else could they do? Admit that they were looters? No, how could they? After all, they were bearing the halo of the Liberation Army. The Soviet propaganda explained the Red Army repressed the peaceful population of Germany fairly simply. It was the people's revenge for the atrocities of the Nazis on our territories. But the Soviet liberators behaved similarly in the Ukrainian lands that were temporarily under Nazi occupation. Alexander Dovzhenko, for example, recalled numerous cases of sexual violence and sadism by the Red Army soldiers against Ukrainian girls and women. The Red Army soldiers justified that very simply. Why did the girls stay under the Germans? Clearly, they lay down with them deliberately.
воно виникає з того розуміння.
That arose from the belief that people are nuts and bolts in a large state machine. And if the Soviet soldiers raped someone in the process of capture or liberation, let's just keep calling that liberation of the territories of Kiev, Podil and Volhynia, then nothing terrible would have happened. Because why would those people remain under the Germans? In other words, they considered the population of the occupied lands traitors. Such was their logic.
Розуміння населення окупованих земель як зрадників. Ви залишились, значить ви зрадники.
They started labeling not just women, but everyone who was under occupation as traitors. It was for a reason that right after the war, all Soviet questionnaires contained a separate question: were you or your relatives in the occupied territory? And if the answer was positive, the person became part of the special category of unreliable citizens of the USSR, without any accusations or explanations. Residents of the Ukrainian capital said that right after Kyiv ended up in the hands of the Soviet army again, iron boxes with the inscription UNKVD appeared in apartment block entrances. That's how the Soviet Ministry of Internal Affairs was called at the time. Residents of Kyiv and later other Ukrainian cities were to drop notes with the names of people who allegedly or actually collaborated with the Nazis into those boxes. One anonymous report was enough for punitive bodies to become interested in a particular individual. Anna Zubenko recalled that she was arrested after one such report, since during the German occupation she was forced to work as a dishwasher in a dining room of the occupants to feed her family. However, ethnic cleansing in the Ukrainian lands was not limited to the arrests of individuals. The Bolshevik system is guilty of much more heinous crimes against humanity. Those were also connected with such a shameful phenomenon as the so-called Black Infantry.
Ми маємо дуже страшні явища, коли червона
There was a terrible phenomenon when the Red Army returned to the territory of Ukraine after a turning point in the war. Having suffered terrible losses, the Soviet army mobilized all men and even boys from the age of 16 who could carry guns up to people of the pre-retirement age. They were sent to assault the enemy positions without uniforms, often even without weapons.
штурмувати ворожі позиції.
І чому їх називали чорносвітники? Їх кидали навіть...
Why were they called the Black Infantry? Because they were thrown into battle without uniforms. They were mobilized wearing black clothing and immediately sent into battle. The losses were huge, but those heroics are not mentioned anywhere officially, when rivers became red from the blood of those who died.
Які ставали червоними від крові тих загиблих.
It was the price that people who were considered traitors and collaborators by the Soviet government paid. Propagandists came up with an entirely unambiguous slogan: treason can only be washed away with one's own blood. The soldiers of panel battalions who were actually guilty of something were supposed to do that along with all the Ukrainian men who had been in the occupation, especially since an opportunity to prove themselves appeared almost immediately for the Black Infantry. People mobilized as the Ukrainian territories were liberated from the Nazis. In the case of the left bank of the Dnipro River, it was in the summer of 1943. In autumn, the Soviet army faced a serious problem. They had to put force along the Dnipro River. The Germans were on the high right bank of the river, but the advancing units of the Red Army were approaching the Dnipro on a low flat coast that practically had no cover. And the Soviet commander Zhukov sent the newly mobilized untrained and unarmed black infantrymen right into that meat grinder. Moreover, there was very little to gain from those combat losses, as according to the plan of the General Staff, the Red Army was supposed to siege Kiev from the north, from the so-called Lutish bridgehead. The operation in the south was just a diversion, and the Black Infantry was supposed to exhaust the Germans and force them to expand their ammunition. It was only in this way that Red Army units could drive the Germans away from the Dnipro.
Термін «чорна піхота» більше насправді відповідає тому, що
The term black infantry appeared due to the fact that those people were civilians wearing civilian clothing, which were dark black. They were average citizens who marched toward the enemy with no chances of survival. They could only win or die while trying to defeat the enemy.
без шансів вижити, з єдиною можливістю або перемогти, або померти.
And for the most part, they died. The first stage of the battle for Dnipro, the Chernihiv-Poltava special operation, cost the Red Army 500,000 wounded and almost 100,000 lives of soldiers that were killed. As a result of the Korsun-Shevchenkivsky special operation on the right bank of the Dnipro River, over 250,000 recently mobilized Ukrainian black infantrymen died over a month of fighting. In total, the Red Army lost almost 800,000 soldiers during the winter-spring of 1944 on this segment of the front. If those numbers were made public after the war, I'm not saying during the war, but if the real Soviet losses were made public in subsequent years after the war, it would have been a disaster. The reason being that had these facts been disclosed, this would have testified to the complete inability of the Soviet leadership to wage war, when they simply drowned the enemy in corpses. The absurd waste of a human resource was best manifested during the final combat operation, the Battle for Berlin. To seize the Nazi capital before the Allies, the USSR advanced 220 kilometers in 23 days of extremely tough and bloody battles. The consequences were predictable. In the last 3 weeks of fighting, the Soviet command lost 81,000 soldiers and nearly 300,000 more were wounded. And all that was done just to raise the red flag above the Reichstag for the American soldiers to see.
Ті, хто здійснили спроби його повісити,
Many of those who attempted to raise the flag over the Reichstag died. Some of those who took part in that event and survived could barely be identified. By the way, as for the standard-bearing hero Contra, he was evicted from Abkhazia when the Georgian-Abkhaz War began, and Abkhazia got the support of the Russian Federation.
війна і Абхазію було підтримано Російською Федерацією.
According to official statistics, the total losses of the USSR in the Second World War are estimated at 27 million people, of which 9 to 11 million were soldiers. At the same time, the German army lost half the number of troops, 4.5 to 5 million. Moreover, the losses of the Germans on the difficult Eastern Front against the USSR were limited to just 500,000 killed. This number also includes the mass non-combat losses of the Germans, who mainly died due to the severe Russian winter frost.
Отже, порівняємо.
So let's compare 500,000 dead Nazis to 9 to 11 million dead Soviet soldiers. In other words, the ratio is 1 to 20. That's what historians mean when they say that the Red Army threw corpses at its enemies instead of grenades. But that's a topic for the next episode of this program. In the meantime, always remember that every phenomenon has its pros and cons. It's pro et contra.
Контра.